Okay, well, thank you. I'm really delighted to be here with two truly amazing colleagues to talk about human rights and climate change. And I'm going to focus specifically on the issue of climate justice, or rather the lack thereof, in Tibet, which is where I conduct most of my research. And as a reminder, Tibet has been incorporated into the People's Republic of China in 1951. So by climate justice, I'm referring first and foremost to the need to address the deep inequities inflicted by class, by race, by country, and by histories of colonialism in both the causes and the consequences of climate change at scales ranging from the global to the very local. Around the world, as we saw in the video just now, we know that those who are worst affected by climate change and have the fewest economic resources to adapt to its harmful effects are also the ones who have contributed least to greenhouse gas emissions. And so climate change is exacerbating underlying inequalities and deepening development gaps, placing a disproportionate burden on the poor and vulnerable. So I think small island states are a well-known example of this climate injustice, citizens of Bangladesh another, and what I'm going to argue is that Tibetan herders are a third example of people who are experiencing climate injustice. I want to start with a quick look at the global scale. So we often hear about China being the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases, and as of 2006, that is true on an annual basis. But if we look at cumulative emissions over time, we see here that the United States is far and away still the largest emitter at 20% versus China's 11%. And this is important because the current and future warming that we're going to experience is determined by cumulative emissions over time. Another way to talk about inequity at the global scale is in terms of per capita emissions, right? How much per person? And after all, why should being born in one country versus another make you entitled to a larger or smaller share of the global commons of the atmosphere? So again, we see here that the US, Australia, Canada, and the UAE, to take some examples, have more than twice the per capita emissions of China even today, and more than 100 times the per capita emissions of several countries of Africa. We also know, of course, that there are large inequalities within countries, both in terms of wealth and in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So what this chart shows is that between 1990 and 2015, the wealthiest 10% of the global population was responsible for almost half of the total growth in greenhouse gas, whereas the poorest 50% were responsible for only 6% of emissions growth. And then lastly, this map of countries most vulnerable to climate change is very much the inverse of what we saw before in terms of those countries with the highest cumulative and per capita emissions. So turning to China, we can also see inequalities within the boundaries of a country. This is a graph of city region greenhouse gas emissions, and you can see that the Tibetan Plateau, which is the southwest here, has very low emissions compared to the rest of the country. So turning to the Tibetan Plateau, which is shown in the map on top, it's a very large area. It's about 1 million square miles, and it's about 1/4 of contemporary PRC's land area. Rangelands account for about 70% of the plateau, and herding, which is very high altitude, it's found between 3,500 and 5,400 meters above sea level, has a very long history of more than 8,000 years. And until very recently, Tibetan herders primarily were subsistence producers. So we also know that the Tibetan Plateau is warming more than double the rate of the global average surface temperature increase. And you can see this in the red box, or 2 red boxes over the plateau. That means that it's experiencing more intense, frequent, and longer duration climate extremes. It also means minimum temperatures are going up, and that might sound like a good thing in cold ecosystems, but actually those ecosystems are very sensitive to the 0 degree or freezing line, right? So when you go above that, you have very intensive shifts. We have permafrost thaw, decrease in snow cover, glacial melt, and accelerating loss of glacial mass. So what does all this mean for local residents? It means a lot of things. I'll talk about just a few of them. One is that the melting permafrost and glaciers has led to a very rapid expansion of lakes. So more than 60 new lakes have appeared on the plateau during the last 50 years. The lakes on the plateau are very shallow basin, so that means a little bit of extra water goes a long way in terms of surface area. They're also closed basins, so they're salty, so when you expand the water, it affects the grasslands. So for example, the second largest lake on the plateau right now has more than doubled in area, surface area, over the last 50 years. This has led to loss of grazing land, decreased livestock productivity in terms of milk, meat, and wool, and decreased livestock numbers. And so all this together is contributing to pressures that are displacing herders from their rangelands, and those are central to maintaining their ties to territory and cultural continuity. In some cases as well, when lakes have been divided, sometimes the division has taken place on old imagery, and people have actually received land that's underwater, and they have very little recourse to change those allocations. Another very important but largely unknown effect of climate change is the declining availability of caterpillar fungus, which is pictured here. This is a prized Chinese medicinal, and it has become one of the most important sources of income for rural Tibetans across the Tibetan Plateau, and I'd be happy to talk more about it if anyone is curious about caterpillar fungus. Another problem, climate change means more extreme weather events, which kills livestock through more severe snowstorms. Here are some things that herders have observed, found through interviews and ethnographic studies. They've seen a decrease in medicinal plant quality, greening up starting later, decrease in vegetation height, milking starting later, lower weight, and size of livestock. So those are all examples of negative impacts experienced by herders who have contributed very little to the problem. I want to shift now from inequity or injustice in terms of the impacts of climate change to adaptation. So China has several white papers about climate change adaptation, and they mention something called turning grazing areas back to grasslands as one strategy for climate adaptation. What this actually means in the Tibetan Plateau, specifically an area that is the headwaters of the Mekong, Yellow, and Yangtze rivers, is ecological migration. In other words, the government has resettled Tibetan herders from their grazing areas, their traditional pastoral territories, to new housing complexes, often located at a very distant area, and after herders are told to sell their livestock. So as one example, from 2004 to 2010, about 55,000 herders and 10,000 households were moved out in the name of environmental protection and climate adaptation. So, does removing grazing actually help the Tibetan Plateau adapt to climate change? Ecological experiments with warming and grazing, so artificial warming and controlled grazing by several colleagues of mine show the opposite, right? And in fact, they found that climate warming is, as we know, bad for the rangelands. It leads to decreased species richness, productivity, less medicinal plants. But in the presence of climate change, if you have moderate grazing, it actually modulates some of those effects. It makes those effects less bad. And this is not very surprising when we consider that the Tibetan Plateau and its plant communities are co-evolved with grazers over tens of thousands of years. So in other words, though framed as climate adaptation, this policy may actually do the reverse in terms of ecological condition. And of course, there are very, very significant social and dislocations with resettlement programs, right? While the government has provided subsidies, these are often delayed, they don't keep up with inflation. Herders face unexpected costs for buying food and fuel. Many settlements are built without much sanitation infrastructure and very poorly. There's a lack of employment after displacement, where herding, of course, entails a very complex set of skills that are no longer relevant after resettlement. Perhaps most importantly, resettlement also moves Tibetans from rural areas where Tibetan language dominates to peri-urban settlements where Chinese predominates, thus working together with broader assimilationist pushes to erode linguistic continuity. So it essentially also dispossesses Tibetans from traditional ties to territory, sacred lakes, sacred mountains, territorial deities, all of which are central to community, identity, and cultural practice. So in other words, like many marginalized people around the world, I would argue that Tibetan herders are as vulnerable to certain policies labeled climate change adaptation as to climate change itself. I want to be clear that this is not to say climate adaptation is not crucial. It is, right? But it has to be done in a way that addresses rather than exacerbates existing injustices. So to conclude, addressing injustice means that those who are most responsible for climate change should bear not only the majority of the costs of mitigation, but also of adaptation, not just for ourselves, but also for people who are most affected. And this is very much not happening on a global scale or a national scale or regionally. So just solutions to climate change really have to address not just its symptoms, but also the interconnected social and political processes that led to the crisis in the first place. Thank you.